A very warm welcome to you on this hot summer evening, actually. It really feels like the summer lecture series of the LBI at the moment. I'm Christina von Hodenberg. I'm the director of the German Historical Institute London. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. Even more of a pleasure to welcome the Leo Baeck Institute and its director, Daniel Wildmann. We often host events together, also in this case. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Andreas Kilcher and also Professor Nicolas Sawicki, who will tell us about Kafka's drawings today. We will record this event. This is also just as an information to our online audience, but everything else you will actually be learning from Daniel Wildmann, who will be chairing the discussion. So I hand over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. I also would like very much to welcome all of you, and from wherever you are, United Kingdom, Germany, the States, to tonight's event, a panel called Images of the Grotesque and Arabesque, the Discovery of Kafka's Drawings. Tonight's panel is organized together between us, jointly the Leo Baeck Institute London and the German Historical Institute London. So my thanks go out to you, Christina, and to your team of the German Historical Institute working together. It's really an honor for us and also a pleasure for us to work together. And today's a premiere. It's the first time after 2.5 years that we have an event again, not on Zoom only, but also here in this beautiful Nash building. It's really thrilling to be back again after such a long time. Tonight's panel is based on a really, truly extraordinary and quite heavy book. This one, quite heavy. Franz Kafka, The Drawings, edited by Andreas Kilcher. And I'm therefore extremely happy to welcome tonight Andreas, the editor, but also Professor Nicolas Sawicki. Let me introduce my guests. Andreas Kilcher. He's a professor of literature and cultural studies at the ETH Zurich, the Technical University of Zurich. His main research interests are history of German Jewish literature and culture, literary and cultural studies, and Kabbalah and esoteric studies. And Andreas has published really very, very widely in all these fields, numerous books, articles, and collection of essays. Let me just mention a few of his publications, otherwise we will never end this evening. And I focus on his publications in English, some of your books in English. So my first example is Constructing Tradition, Means and Myth of Transmission in Western Esotericism, published in 2010, a collection of essays and edited by Andreas Kilcher. My second example, Writing Jewish Culture, Paradoxes in Ethnography, published in 2016 with Indiana University Press and edited together with Gabriela Safran. And finally, a heavy book, Franz Kafka, The Drawings. Nicolas Sawicki, our second guest. He's an art historian by trade, and he's a professor at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in the States. And thank you very much for coming from so far away, towards all these problems with COVID and flight and etc. to London. Very happy to have you here, finally. His main interests of research are early 20th century European art, modernism, especially modern Czech art, and the history of exhibitions, collecting, and transnational artistic exchange. Also, Nicolas has published widely in all his fields, and I take the liberty, again, just to mention some of your books. So my first example is The Eight and its Circle in the years 90 to 2010, published in 2014. My second example is a collection of essays, also a big book, a bit less heavy in weight, but not in content. And it goes by the title, Friedrich Feigl, 1884 to 1965, published in 2010 very interesting, especially for us Londoners. It's about a Jewish Czech artist who lived in London, Belsize Park, by the way. Now, how do we organize tonight's panel? Firstly, Andreas will open the event with a short presentation on Kafka's drawings. He will speak for about 10 minutes, not more, just 10 minutes. And then this will be followed by a discussion or debate between my two guests, between Nicolas and Andreas. And they will speak for discuss about 35, maybe 40 minutes about these drawings. And finally, I will open the floor for a Q&A session. So Andreas and Nicolas, over to you.
Yeah. Now it's on. So again, thanks a lot for the introduction and for having us here. I'm really happy to have this event in this, I think, very fitting cooperation of the German Historical Institute and the Leo Baeck Institute. And yeah, I think there are many connections that go in these two institutions, or they are discussing or going to discuss in this evening. So what I'm going to do here is not more than an introduction to our conversation, which is the main part. And so we agreed that I begin with just depicting the way of the transmission of this drawing, answering somehow the question, how was it possible that only now we learn about these drawings of this, I mean, eminent writer about whom we know basically everything, but all at once we have this convolute of drawings we have never seen so far. So let me start with, so how does it advance? Doesn't advance? Maybe here. Oh, yeah. Let me start by recalling what you maybe known or you could have known so far on Kafka's drawings. Actually, it was Kafka's friend, Max Brod, I think I don't have to introduce him, who together with his publication of the writings of Kafka started in 1937 to show a few examples of the drawings. And this happens at first in his biography on Kafka, and you may not be able to read it, but here it says, with a few examples of his drawings. And this is one of these examples, the drinker, which we could call him. That's the first, or one of the first drawings we know since, you see, 1937. And in the coming decades until the death of Max Brod in 1968, he continued to give some kind of examples of this convolute, which he actually started to collect himself already as a student in the beginning of the 20th century. And interesting for us to learn about how this came in that early time of their friendship, Kafka's and Brod's friendship in the early 20th century, starting from 1901 to 1906-07, when Kafka was studying and Brod also studying law in Prague. So Kafka was drawing and Brod was collecting the drawings. And it's interesting what he says in a publication from 1948 on Kafka, another one, in which he also added a few more of these drawings and saying, explaining in a somehow note, Kafka was even more indifferent or perhaps better, more hostile to his drawings than he was to his literary production. Anything that I didn't rescue was destroyed. And we are talking now about that time in the very early time from 1901 to 1906-07. I had him give me his scribblings, or I rescued them from the wastebasket. Indeed, I cut a number of them from the margins of the course notes from his legal studies. And then he also says, I still have a large number of them which will appear one day as a Kafka portfolio. So we see Max Brod, he collected these drawings, also the ones that Kafka probably wanted to throw away, like actually not only his drawings, also part of his writing. And he had this idea to publish the drawings in 1948 at least, but he never did it. Instead, what we know is probably these drawings. I'm quite sure some of you are familiar with them because they somehow got popular. It's only a small part of this convolute, but these got popular because they have been put on the cover of the German editions of the pocketbook edition in a publisher called Fischer Verlag, Fischer Bücherei. You see these in the 50s. From then on, I think we can say that these handful of drawings, a few of these drawings, they got really iconic to quite a large extent. But the large amount of these drawings never have been known. And what we have seen before, the idea of publishing a portfolio of Kafka's drawings, this was a footnote that I think nobody has taken note. Only a very few people have realized that there is much more. Let's have a quick look, not only on the publication, but also on the transmission of the drawings, because this also explains why Brod in the end didn't publish this portfolio, and why the drawings have been somehow kept and even locked away for decades, and nobody hardly knew about this. So when Kafka died, Brod collected all the materials, the estate of Kafka, and started to edit it partly. So the novels, they have been published right after Kafka's death. They have been published like The Trial and the Castle and America. But only a part of these materials, let's say the estate, have been published by Brod. And of course, not the drawings. And one of the reasons is that he stopped publishing drawings, or only a few examples he could publish, was because he donated actually not only the drawing, but most of his writings to his secretary, Ilse Esterhofer, which you see here, together with Brod. Brod's wife died shortly after they immigrated to Tel Aviv, to Palestine, in 1939. They flew from the Nazis who came to Prague, and they flew actually in the last possible moment by train and then by ship to Haifa and then Tel Aviv. And he took everything with him, but since his wife died shortly after, he was somehow started to work together with this person he didn't know before, Ilse Esterhofer. And since he couldn't pay her off for her work, he donated his entire estate. So she now started to control the process of publication. She could interfere first, more or less, in the background, and when Brod died in 1968, she was the one who was really dealing with Kafka's and Brod's estate, and she blocked every attempt to publish the drawings. So basically, this is why we didn't know about these drawings for decades. And to be very concrete, it's interesting that these drawings have been locked away in a banquet in Zurich at the, like in a James Bond film. So you have always these sequences when the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich is a part of a movie, because there are the numbers. How do you say that? Time number accounts, exactly. So anonymous accounts, and in one of these drawings have been locked away for decades, until actually in the year 2019. And the year 2019 was the end of a trial on the estate of Brod and Kafka, which started right after Ilse Esterhofer died. And I can't go into this trial here, but it's just interesting to see that the National Library of Israel was questioning this donation of the estate of Kafka to Ilse Esterhofer was right, and the library refuted the donation and also the testament of Brod, and they were this refutation was actually approved by the Israeli courts up to the Supreme Court, so that in the end all the material that was in Zurich had to go to Jerusalem in the end of in the summer of 2019. So you see, it's very recently only that this material got to an archive, to a library, to National Library of Israel, and only since then it got accessible for the public, which means first of all for research, and that was precisely the moment when I traveled to Jerusalem and went to the archive and started the project. So that's actually more or less the short story of the transmission of these drawings. But I think now we should start to talk about the drawings and see what in the conversation comes out of it, because so far you have seen just a few examples that you already have known. So am I right that I have to turn off the mic now? Oops. And
that mic is on.
Yeah, you have to help me. I don't want to destroy that.
That one. Second.
Well, Andreas, thank you very much for such an introduction, and thank you to you and to Daniel and to Christina for the invitation to join you this evening to talk about these drawings. You and I have been talking about them informally for the past year or so. One of the things that I never quite came to understand is, when is it that you yourself, as a scholar of Kafka, really first became aware of the drawings and came to the realization that drawing for Kafka in the early stages of his life constituted a very important practice? Was this in 2019, or did it happen earlier? Mm-hmm. Maybe for starters, maybe you could orient us and talk a little bit about how you came to the material.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it allows me to go back a little bit once more to this trial, because actually it wasn't in that context. I have actually been following the trials, this trial on Kafka's estate, because I mean it was really sensational, and some of the journals made an even greater sensation out of it, because they were speculating about unknown novels or at least stories by Kafka, which was of course really speculation and wrong, because everything was published, which was in the banquet in Zurich. But since I was writing and following the trial and all these verdicts, it was, to me, it got clear what is actually the interesting part that we didn't know so far, because there was something we didn't know so far, and these were the drawings. And if I may go back quickly here, this small part you see here on the right hand, you see, this is a list, somehow an inventory that has been made of the items that were locked away in the banquets, and which remained in Zurich also until 2019, actually. And you see here point 22, drawings and so on, the drawings. And it got clear to me there were quite a lot of drawings there, but it wasn't clear at all what drawings, how many drawings, how they look like, and of course this made me extremely curious to get a look on these drawings and to learn how many drawings these are, what kind of drawings. So it was actually in the course of this trial that I got aware of these drawings. And the idea to publish the drawings came towards the end of the trial, because it was clear there is really something there.
Yes, really something there. You were one of the first people to pick up on this. As you mentioned, most scholars weren't clued into this, that there was a whole body of material there. What did it feel like, if I can ask, when you got there in 2019 to look at them? What did it feel like to open? I mean, it was one envelope or one box, as I think you put it. How did that feel to open it and to see all that material?
Yeah, I mean, this was an excitement. You sit there and you get these folders from the desk in the archives. You sit in the archives, one folder after the other. You open them and you see things nobody has seen so far. Maybe, of course, the one who is doing work in the archives, so they have seen it, but nobody has worked on it. Nobody's really seen it, and this was, it was a moment of excitement and elevation. So I mean, things you never have seen. Suddenly you see it, and
Up till that point, we had known only about 40 or so drawings that were published. You know my story of discovering or seeing them for the first time. It has a London connection, so I tell it in summary.
Yeah, you should, because I think you probably knew even earlier than I did about these drawings.
Yes.
Or at least a part of it,
I was at the Tate Archive in 2015 doing some work in the papers of a Czechoslovak emigre art historian and critic named J.P. Hodin, who was a very eminent, prominent critic in Britain, an art critic from the 40s to the 1960s. And he had taken up a correspondence with Max Brod in the early 1950s about organizing an exhibition of Kafka's drawings here at the ICA in London, if you would believe it. A quite serious idea. And in the course of their exchange and correspondence, Max Brod sent J.P. Hodin 20 black and white photographs of drawings that had, for the most part, never been reproduced. I think there was one that had been reproduced. And I came across the material by accident and sort of had, maybe not quite the reaction that you had because they're reproductions, but I immediately saw that with 20 drawings that no one had seen, many of them quite interesting, there had to be more. Right. And so Hodin, who lived in Hampstead, was probably the only other person besides, you and others who opened the archive in 2019 to see the drawings and to think of them as significant. He saw only a small portion, 20 images, but it's an interesting connection.
And he saw black and white photos that Max Brod was very hesitant to pass them on to him, and never the negatives. And what is funny is that I found in the archive in Jerusalem the negatives.
Yes,
and so we from two sides worked on the same material.
Let's shift a little bit more to talking about the drawings themselves. One of the I think one of the real findings of the book and one of the very interesting things that you come to in your research is that these drawings were mostly created very early. You point to them being created, I mean, it's hard for us to know exactly, but you point to them being created in the later part of Kafka's secondary school studies and during university, maybe in the year or two thereafter. So roughly 1900, 1901 to maybe 1907, somewhere there. It fits in any case. And you point in the book to the important connections that he had to the Prague artistic scene at the time. And you talk about figures like Emil Orlik and Alfred Kubin, who were active in Prague, and Kafka's connections to them. And it made me wonder upon reading the book, whether for Kafka at that time period, right, in that first decade of the 20th century, is it possible that for him in Prague locally, the artistic scene seemed more vibrant than the literary scene? And I'm thinking in particular about how, you know, that young generation of German language Prague writers had not yet really come into its own yet, and the older generation had left. Rilke and others had departed Prague long ago. The literary scene was not actually very vibrant, but there was a lot happening in the arts, and you point to this. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about what things were like there artistically, and whether it's possible that you know, the Kafka before he came to see Prague as a literary city saw it as a city of artists.
Yeah, I wouldn't, let's say, historically concurrence the literary and the art scene. I wouldn't say the one is more vibrant than the other, but I think our historical consciousness is somehow misguided by focusing on literature and seeing that, okay, this Prague is the city of literature, and you are totally right. It was by far not only about literature. And even more probably, art was part of a scene around 1900 that for Kafka was probably important even before he started to write. And I think one detail in the biography of Max Brod on Kafka is quite illuminating. He says when he met Kafka, for some years, he didn't even know that he was writing, but for sure he knew that he was drawing.
Yeah.
So for the first, he learned Kafka as a draftsman, as somebody who is making drawings, and not as somebody who is writing. I mean, it was clear Kafka was also starting to write at that time, but he was more ambitious in drawing, and probably this is also fitting to quite some other people, some other young, let's say, artists, intellectuals in Prague. They were very much interested in art, focused on art. And you're talking about these groups in Prague that were active by making exhibitions and also inviting important artists to Prague, like Edvard Munch and of course also Emil Orlik, who was himself a Bohemian, but he was much more known he was known all over the world. He had this big exhibition in Berlin, but they invited him back to Prague, and these were the events for these young students like Kafka and Brod, and so everybody went to these exhibitions. And if I already talk about it, I could jump to that one.
Sure, yeah.
This is the Orlik show in 1902, which was, I would say, electrifying all these young students, including Kafka, who had to plan to give a lecture on Emil Orlik, on Japan, called Japan and We, but in the end he didn't do it. Most of his colleagues around him did, like Max Horb. He was writing on the exhibition, and many others, also former classmates of Kafka. Yeah. So you see, you're totally right. Art was really the interesting event. So
I mean, of course, it's a bit of a leading question. I'm an art historian, and then, you know, that's my supposition already. But I think that I mean, you might not say it about every time period, but 1900 to 1902. formative period. In 1902, a new building is built for the Prague Academy of Fine Arts, and its enrollment doubles. In 1902, the first Kunsthalle is built in Prague, and it has as its first exhibition a massive show of Auguste Rodin's sculptures. And a few years later, an exhibition of his drawings. And a few years later, an exhibition of Edvard Munch's work in 1907, Vincent van Gogh. I mean, I think when you're young and you're that age that Kafka is or was, or Max Brod, you want to be where the energy is, and there was a lot of energy there. Not, again, not to oppose the literary and the visual, but there was energy and excitement there.
Absolutely.
Max Brod as well gravitated at that same time period to the artists and to writing about the visual arts and collecting work as well. So for him, for a moment as well, that seemed to be where the action was, right?
Yeah, true. Max Brod, we think when you think of Max Brod, we think, okay, that's the one who was promoting Kafka and maybe also Franz Werfel and a few other writers. So he is the, let's say, the impresario of writers. But it's absolutely not only writers that he was really supporting and helping them to get known. It was there were also many artists among them, like especially Alfred Kubin, who I think without the help of Max Brod wouldn't have been known so at that time. So he was really defending Kubin and saying, this is a really important artist. We have to take him really seriously.
Yeah, and you've made a point in the book and in the writing that some of the drawings, not item for item, but that we can think of them in part as a response on Kafka's part to what he is seeing, right? That they are adaptive in that way, that he's drawing as he's looking at Orlik and at, if you go back to the previous slide, this drawing that you and I were talking about recently with the two figures. This is the drawing at left. When we were speaking about this last, I was looking at this image in the leftmost figure, the seated black figure. This is absolutely an adaptation from Edvard Munch, who had that show in 1905. That figure in the form of the head really echoes Munch's work, and the figure seated next to this is pretty much a dead ringer for Van Gogh's portraits of the postman Josef Roland. Van Gogh was shown a few years later in Prague, and of course he was reproduced very widely. And it's interesting. I think what the book does really well, from my perspective, is that it considers the drawings as drawings without yet connecting them to Kafka's literary writings, and it considers their relationship to this visual culture there, right? Which is very important. It's sort of hard not to see the connection here, and drawing can be responsive in that way, right? This is not an observational drawing from nature. It's a drawing that's responsive to a certain kind of visual culture that's already there in the city.
You suggested to make this juxtaposition. I think it's very illuminating, but it shows really that one thing that we also didn't really know so far, to what extent Kafka was aware of what happened in the world of art, not only, let's say, the lesser known artists in Prague, but also the really known ones, the contemporary ones, but also older art, which he was very aware of. Together with Brod, they traveled to Paris. Visiting the Louvre was, of course, somehow the goal of this whole travel through Europe to Paris, and he was describing art in the Louvre, especially sculptures. He was, what I want to say, was really attentive of the art around him, being contemporary artists and exhibitions, or the more classical one in the museums. So he was attentive to.
He was attentive. He was looking.
Yeah.
Both you and Judith Butler, in her contribution to the book, begin to characterize Kafka's style of rendering, insofar as we can determine that we only have those 150 or so drawings. So it's not an enormous body of work on which to make those kinds of conclusions, but you start to characterize the drawings. And what both you and Judith hold in common in how you write about the drawings is that you point to their abbreviated nature, to the kind of visual economy of line, right? That there's not much detail there, that they're quickly rendered. Judith in her essay talks in particular about how the figures generally lack ground and setting, that they are sort of groundless and floating. And I wonder if you wanted to say maybe more about what you see in that style and in that sort of abbreviated nature of drawing that we see in quite a lot of the drawings, this one as well, and I think some of the others that you queued up.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point to let's say to get an impression or an understanding of the specific style. And I think if I may quickly jump again to Orlik. I mean, Orlik was not the first artist of interest for Kafka, but I would say he focused Kafka's attention to something which goes just in that direction. You see here by Emil Orlik, the Zeichner, the drawer or the draftsman, just drawing a line. The line is probably, it's always the basic, which of course not only is the basic for drawing, also for writing. And Orlik is even writing on that, explaining explaining on his exhibition that the Japanese way of drawing and of woodcut is very close to the writing, because there is this abstraction, this minimalization to the line, and you could also call it to express with the least means the maximum of contents. And so this is a kind of drawing that is approaching through this type of abstraction the writing. And I think this figure of Orlik is very close to the aesthetics of Kafka's drawings, not in the sense that Kafka was, let's say, drawing in the style of the Japanese woodcut. There are some drawings that have that, but in this aesthetic way. And what is funny is that Kafka in 1908 wrote a postcard to Max Brod with a picture of Hiroshige on it, a woodcut, a color woodcut of Hiroshige, and explaining my most beautiful postcard. So I kiss you, dearest Max, I kiss you here on a dirty, but my most beautiful postcard. So, which also makes clear that this type of aesthetic is really fascinating him. And I think that there goes a certain line from this Japonisme to his way of drawing, which we may see here one example.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense. I think what you said to say the most with the least, right? That kind of visual economy, which I like maybe more for the moment now than the term abstraction, which is so freighted. But
exactly.
I also think it's interesting that, I mean, obviously in a drawing like this is an ink drawing. Kafka focuses on gesture and posture and movement, right? That's what he's trying to capture. It's not details, it's not the face, it's a gesture drawing. What's interesting to me too is that that kind of visual economy that Orlik sees in the Japanese works that he's seeing when he travels and that he promotes in Prague, that sort of visual economy. It's also fundamentally a part of a certain kind of drawing practice that is endemic among artists, the sketch, right? The sketch,
right.
When one sits and sketches, it's always about an economy of means. You focus on a particular detail that captures your attention. You notice the detail and you render the detail, but everything else is, hence the groundlessness. So I'm also wondering whether, on a much more prosaic level, right? Whether Kafka was also adapting ideas from just the sort of basic sketch practice, right? If you look at the sketchbooks of other artists in Prague, in that first decade of the 20th century. Well, the figures don't look quite like this, but most of them are groundless and rootless and floating because there was no need to render the surroundings, right? You just rendered the pose or the gesture, a facial expression, right? Of course, he takes it in a very different direction to reducing until there's very little left, right? Like in this drawing here. But
it's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, what you see here, this is the reduction to the lines.
Yes.
It's only lines, but the lines are this movement in the lines. But your question, I think it's really important because it's about the emancipation of drawing, of Zeichnen, of these kind of sketches. Because until then, around 1900, probably we could say a piece of art is oil on canvas, is colorful, it's a real work. And you have these drawings, it's a sketch that maybe leads in the end to a real piece of art, to the work of art, the oeuvre. And the drawing is like, you can't take it serious.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And you wouldn't exhibit these drawings. You wouldn't claim that this is in the. And Kafka was reading a book by Oscar B. On the drawing, das Zeichnen. And Oscar B. is making an interesting point. And this is precisely the point he makes, that the drawing is about to emancipate itself from art as an own way of art. And I think here will be really interesting to see if to what extent there is a context to this emancipation of the drawing from the, how would you call it?
Well, from this hierarchy of the fine arts and the hierarchy of medium, right, which claims that only painting matters, right?
Right.
But I think this is precisely the moment where that happens. So in Prague, you start having shows between 1906 and 1909 of drawings. There's a show even in the Kunsthalle that I was speaking about that's built in 1902 that is titled in the exhibition A Show of Sketches, which is another even, a term that goes beyond, right, drawing, but the sketch. So it's at that moment that Kafka is drawing, that drawing is in fact becoming emancipated, that it's sort of taking a seat at the table alongside painting and sculpture, partly because such fantastic artists like Rodin and others are showing their drawings in Prague. I mean, when you see these things, they have, enormous capacity to communicate with the real visual economy. So I think you're quite right that this is when that's happening. It's precisely the right moment. The other quality that you notice and that you write about in the book is this sort of tendency by Kafka to exaggerate certain features, particularly of the body. And I think that the title of today's presentation, I mean, the word grotesque is in the title, right, which is all about the exaggeration and the distortion of
I think the Edgar Allan Poe, so they see the reference. The stories of the grotesque and the arabesque. They go to the images of the grotesque and the arabesque.
So what do you make of Kafka's exaggeration of, in particular, I think bodily forms and figures? There are a couple of images as well that you have of the couple, the two figures with the very exaggerated faces and ears. There's that, not here, but somewhere later, but there's this, the drinker, and these two, right? This tendency to exaggerate bodily features in particular. How do you interpret that and what do you make of it?
I think maybe we could start
here,
with these two. I mean, when I was inspired by Poe for the title, then I thought of these type of figures that are, you could hardly describe them otherwise than grotesque. And why grotesque? In what sense grotesque or arabesque? I mean, these are deformed bodies. They are not in no way realistic. They're more like dreamways or dreamwise painted or drawn. And and the limbs and the parts of the bodies are distorted. And yeah, I think the concept of the grotesque body, I mean, it comes from a mannerism. It's maybe could go back to the 16th century, if you like. But in that sense, I think it's something that comes together also with the attention to the body. Yeah. And I think Judith Butler, especially, she is describing this moment. But I think you see it here that, I mean, of what are these bodies consisting of? It's mostly limbs, very long legs, very long arms, and everything is transformed into something like arms and legs, and the face is somehow shrinking. It's not the only example. We can also go back to that one. Yeah. So it's not a portrait. It's not the art of portrait, but it's the body that is interesting. The body in the move, yeah, and the body in a deformation. And I think that's what I mean with the grotesque. And there's another element of the grotesque, and this is the carnivalesque. This is the comic element.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which you talk about, and you talk about the connection to caricature as well, that I've written a little bit about too, that some of these drawings share elements with the practice of caricature, which is a form of exaggeration and deformation for effect, or for comic effect, right? And I mean, you might look at some of these too as sort of comedic. This figure on the left in particular, sort of striding, and the way that he deforms that leg is really to amplify that effect of movement, right? Here's someone prancing, prancing through space in a rather sort of haughty way. And in the same way here, this figure's spine leans and curves in a way that makes the figure look like the supplicant in one of the other drawings, right? As someone who is really not moving boldly through space. A great majority of the drawings are of bodies and figures. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah. So that seems to be where Kafka trained his sight. And these are not observational again, right? These are not drawn from nature, but I wonder if they were drawn after memories of certain gestures that he observed. I mean, he was a real observer of people. We know that from the letters and the diaries.
Yeah,
and his literary writing,
also from the stories and the novels.
Yeah.
So if you go to the very early stories, like Description of a Struggle, Beschreibung eines Kampfes, there you have precisely these bodies, these distorted, grotesque bodies, and I think it's really true that he was somehow focused on the body. Also his own body,
yes.
By the way, I mean, he was really occupied with his own body, with health, and all these was part of his interest. And just a detail, what is interesting, he is also interested in shoes.
Yes.
So he pays more attention to shoes than to faces.
Yeah. He even puts rain boots on the dog that's being walked by the.
Yeah, we should.
And I had to read up about this. Apparently, this was something that one did, is the dogs wore rain boots. The feet are a preoccupation. Of course. Yeah, it's really interesting. It would be, of course, most of this precedes the writing. It would be interesting to kind of reimagine how we understand Kafka as a writer by foregrounding the drawings first in a way chronologically, right? We know that this kind of noticing, the visual noticing, and then trying to record it visually preceded the attempts to do that with text, right?
I think we have now with these drawings the means in the hand to understand the writing in a new perspective. So far, when the drawings have been, let's say, taken into account, then they have been always understood as illustrations of the writing. So there's a publication on the drawings that we knew so far, which came out actually in the 90s. The drawings have been put aside with the writings side by side, and they made the impression, the editors wanted to make the impression that the drawings are describing something that he has written, so as an illustration. But it's just, as you said, it's the other way around. I think we can understand the early writing and the writing from the drawing.
Yes, yeah. And this is the first time really that in the book that we have scholarship that's making, that's making that claim, because indeed the way that what little was known of the drawings, as you're putting it, they were always interpreted as being illustrative, right, of a certain text. And in fact, they weren't. So drawing here carries a completely different function, right? It's not drawing to elaborate on something that's been written, it's drawing for its own sake at the moment. Let's talk a little bit about, I know we're probably running close on time, about that connection between writing and drawing. And I wanted to go back to a part of the book where you discuss Kafka's own hesitance and resistance to having his own publications illustrated. There are two examples that you go into in the book where Kafka's publisher approaches him with the prospect of having the writings illustrated. In both cases, Kafka really sort of recoils, and wonder if you could tell us the story again and maybe give us an interpretation from your standpoint of how you understand that resistance on the part of someone who's already preoccupied with drawing, right? Why no drawings in the, or why the resistance to including drawings?
Exactly. So it would have been very, let's say, natural for Kafka. We could think that his stories, his books could have been illustrated since he was already so attentive to drawing. But these examples show just the contrary. So he was very hesitant about illustration. And this is, we have to imagine Kafka, he didn't know about the illustration. So when this was his second book, the Stoker, the Heizer, 1913, it came out. And when he opened up the box, the books have been sent to his home. He opens the box and excited, opens the book and sees, oh, what is this painting or this picture doing there? And he was really shocked and writing to the publisher, what's happening? What did he do here? And he was not at all pleased. He was we could say he was shocked, and objected that. And it was clear. He made also clear why, because the picture is not only too strong but also misleading. He was then explained by the publisher what it is. It's from William Henry Bartlett, the Ferry at Brooklyn. 1838, much too early for Kafka's idea of a modern, the harbor of New York with steamboats and large steamboats, not these small ferry boats. So this was misleading, but it was also much too strong. So precisely because he knew of the power of the image, he was so hesitant about juxtaposing or illustrating his text. And the second example, we are finishing, I know we should. The second example is probably even more known. This is the Metamorphosis. So this was actually the next book to be published, the Metamorphosis. And when it was published, the editor again wanted to illustrate it. Because he was working together with an artist called Ottomar Starke. I'm not sure if he is known today, but at the time he was very known. He was illustrating many books, especially for Kurt Wolf Verlag. And Kafka was writing to the publisher and saying, please don't do it. And you see here just the highlighted part. The insect itself cannot be depicted. It cannot even be shown from a distance. So please don't show the insect. In order to be really on the safe side, he made the proposition what could be done. And this is the lower part. And this is interesting because in the end, Kafka, in a way, he illustrated his own drawing because he gave Ottomar Starke the idea, or through the publisher. So what he said, what would be possible if it were to offer suggestions for an illustration, I would choose such scenes as the following: the parents and the head clerk in front of the locked door, or even better, and that you see what's actually Ottmar Starke did in the end, the parents and the sister in the lighted room with the door open upon the adjoining room that lies in the darkness. So this is the prescription for what could be possible. So if you really have to illustrate the book, then you have to do it in that way. And actually, Starke did it, more or less, mostly. So I know we should end here.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you. So.
Thanks a lot, Andreas and Nicolas, for your extremely enlightening discussion about this fascinating triangle between, as you called it, emancipation of drawings, visual economy, and the grotesque. And this triangle really explains a lot about these drawings. And now I would like to open the floor for your questions as well here in the room, as well over there on Zoom. In order to see if you have questions on Zoom, that's the way how we do it. Could you please, if you have a question, raise your hand with the yellow sign of the hand. That's one way, so you can make yourself visible to us. Another kind of trick would be if you put in the chat just your name, so my assistants can see your names and tell me who to call up for a question. So the floor is open.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. I've got sort of two interrelated questions. I mean, I think the first one is the one that's burning under all our nails, and you've sort of started answering, is what do we do with it, with these drawings, but also what's the danger maybe of using these drawings? Because I think like one of you said that seeing the pictures, the drawings as a photograph wasn't as exciting as seeing it as the real thing, and that sort of had this idea, I think, of like a Benjaminian aura behind it. But I was wondering, and this is coming from the kind of perspective of an intellectual historian, where perhaps the dangers are in essentializing these images as expressing some kind of like pure idea that the text can't express as well. But I mean, that's obviously a very broad question. I think it's going to be answered in the coming years when people start to interpret this. My second and more specific question is about the kind of the bodily in these drawings, and adding another layer, like the layer of the political to it, because Kafka was interested also in industrialization in his work, through his work with factory workers, but he was also interested in colonialism, like the penal colony, for example, and that is like colonialism worked through on the body, on the physical form. So I was wondering to what extent we can in these drawings already see also an engagement with these political questions at the time, with the way that politics is exercised through the body. Can we see him going through these thought processes already then, or is that something that's absent at that time?
Yeah.
It's absolutely true that Kafka was interested in let's say, political, social, not only, let's say, personal, psychological, or family questions, but also. Just sorry. Oh, it's. Of course, in his writings, this is very clear, especially in his drawings, you see that it's not so easy. First of all, the drawings, I was very interested in what the interpretations are. say to just see, to look at them and to describe what I see and to follow, let's say, the first visual impression of the drawings and not to interpret them too deeply. Or, one problem is that, of course, Kafka was giving only rarely titles to the drawings. There are few which have titles, so you don't really see the direction that it's going from the title. I think this is a dangerous connection between the title and the drawing. Also, not only seeing kind of quality or where you have this kind of subtext of, yeah, it's a comment on something which is a social question probably. But I would say at the same time, it's also another type of richness that is discussed there. The roots of the poem. Let's say I don't want to promote drawings. Okay, so batteries are probably missing. Okay, now it sounds different. And I think you're right. It's not about promoting the drawings or making them, let's say, all of a sudden the most important part of Kafka's work. That's not the case. So yeah, but still to understand the relation, to take into account the drawings now and to understand the relation between the drawing and the writing, this is the difficult part. And I'm not the one who is giving the solution. I think now people should start working on it.
Add something,
I would certainly agree. It seems early to engage in that kind of interpretive work, right? This is an excavation, this book, in some sense, right? It's an empirical project on the one hand of collecting and archiving and labeling and sort of figuring out where everything is. One thing caught my attention in your question, and I just wanted to add to this, and this is the part about the political, right? Kafka's interest in the political. One place one might look in the drawings for that, from my perspective, is in the way that he treats dress and costume. And as indexical of class and the attention that he pays to clothing, right, which has been written about by Mark Anderson and others who've written on this topic, but it feels like it's there. There are even a few drawings. I think you point out that there are drawings of waitstaff in cafes and restaurants, right? So there's an attentiveness on Kafka's part in the drawings to class, to age, to health. again, it's early. Those are just sort of first impressions, but I think that might be one place to look.
So if I understood both of you correctly, so this heavy book is work in progress.
I think it's in a way.
Oh. In a way, it's the beginning. So as an editor, you shouldn't do all the work, of course. So I lay down the material for further research, and probably I myself will start working also in a more, let's say, interpretive way with these drawings than I did in the book. But yeah, I hope I'm looking forward to research on that. Yeah.
There are some more questions. I think Kinga has a question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this really fascinating talk. I must say I had quite a thorough peek at the book before, because I was lucky to receive it for Christmas. So I've got one impression about the drawings that I wonder what you think about it. And that links to Emily's question. Looking at the images, there's often very comical elements that you've also emphasized. And I was wondering how this corpus of imagery give us an access to what Kafka saw, how he saw it, and in a way also to his very intimate perception of the world, particularly the caricatures, the overemphasis of certain features. I quite clearly see how you linked it to the art scene developing around him, which is absolutely fascinating. And the article was such a joy to read and to listen to you, of course, as well. But when I look at the images, having read Kafka for many, many years, it's just something so intimate, something about them that is really deeply personal. And I wonder whether we just get access to this somehow almost very humorous person that he was, sitting in a cafe and drawing the people around him. And the second question I have is completely different, and please forgive me if I bring it up right after this one. It's about Ilse Esther Hoffer. What do we know about her work with the collection, and what do we know about her motives to withhold it? Because we tend to get a footnote about her that she's the one who kept them under lock. Do we know anything about why and what she saw in these images, what she analyzed about them, and how she worked with Brod on them? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first question, true, the comic element is very obvious, much more obvious than in his writings. And I think that's another lesson or something else, another aspect that we can get from his drawings, also to understand his writing, that the comic element plays a large role, that it's, yeah, a humorous access to reality that Kafka is proposing and experimenting with. We try to catch this with these terms, the grotesque and the arabesque, but it's true. It's also the caricature, it's the comic. And I think to answer your question, the question, namely, how did Kafka see the world? It's by no means any kind of realism that he was trying to attend or to produce, which means to show reality as it is, or what you also maybe learn in the art school, learn how to draw. Actually, he took lessons. He wrote about that in a letter to his fiancée Felice. He wrote that he took drawing lessons, and he said that his teacher nearly spoiled his talent. And it's interesting that he was rejecting any kind of let's say school type of drawing, what you learn at the academy or the school, which is probably more like how do you depict the portrait and the body with its proportions, and it shouldn't be wrong, it should be as it is, which is probably somehow realistic. And I think Kafka describes what he sees in his in a way that he transforms what he sees according to his, probably you could call it fantasy or interest or criticism or whatever. He is transforming what he sees. And I think the comic element is a way to transform reality. So probably you would jump in here also with Nick.
Absolutely, he's transforming what he sees. It's interesting that in the illustrations that appear in the book, we actually see a few of Kafka's, what we think are his early attempts to render faces in a more conventional, naturalistic manner, but there are only a few of them. So clearly that for him, it's a kind of dead end, right? There's something deeply uninteresting for him about that kind of detailed naturalism, or maybe it's unnecessary, right? Maybe you can, as you put it earlier, right? Maybe you can do more with less, right? Yeah.
And Kinga, the second question about, remember her second question?
Yeah, exactly. About Hoffe, what was the interests of Hoffe, and yeah, I mean, this is a complex story. It's one aspect is, yeah, probably the relationship between her and Max Brod, and her yeah, role as the one who is dealing with the estate, not only of Kafka, but also of Brod, actually of both of them, and already during Max Brod's lifetime. And I mean, that Brod donated this entire estate to her already in 1947, 20 years before he died, which is really quite a thing to do that. He couldn't make that public. He didn't, actually. This was something like a secret agreement between them. Nobody knew about that. But it somehow made, to a certain extent, impossible to Brod to act freely with this material. And it was clear that he could edit the writings. She never would have opposed that. She couldn't have done it. But I assume that she had quite an eye on the drawings. And there is also a sign of that after Brod died in 1974, she edited once more the biography, and there is a note in the impressum. Do you say that like this? In the printing information where it says copyright of the drawings to Ilse Esther Hoffe. So it makes very clear. So this is the part she really wants to be sure about, that this is in her copyright and her possession. While the writing she couldn't really, let's say, hold back or control or whatever. And yeah, she was. I think this is a hypothesis because she never really explained what she had in her mind, but. Probably she had the idea that at a certain point she would sell the drawings, and she waited until the price is going up and up. So this is a hypothesis. I'm not 100% sure. There are no proofs of that, but I mean she sold other parts after Brod's death. She started to sell manuscripts of Kafka, and with the spectacular case of the trial, the manuscript of the trial, the Prozess, for which she got, I think it was here in London, the auction, and she got, I think, £1 million at the time for the trial.
Thank you.
We have a question online. Seb Coxon, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a bit of a peculiar question, and my excuse is I'm a medievalist. I'm not a modernist and I'm not a Kafka specialist, but every year I have first year students at UCL in the Department of German and we teach them Kafka. So I'm really looking forward to working with them about through these images. My question is, have you noticed any correlation between sketch types and the paper used? So it struck me, I have a secondary question too. It struck me as interesting that some of the images are on lined paper and some are on blank paper. My secondary question is, one of the initial comments you made was that these are images, many of these images are from the margins. And you know, there was a major thing in the 80s in medieval studies and somebody studies saying we shouldn't be looking at the major pictures in the manuscripts, the really interesting images, the images in the margins. And am I right in thinking that these images in the margins were cut away from the text, because the obvious point of textual reference, or the obvious point to look where you want to measure these images against the text, is the text in whose margins these sketches were originally done. And that in turn might also relate to one of the issues raised here with the question, which is comedy. I mean, if we're talking about legal notes taken in legal school and law classes, and then these images in the margins of those things, there will be some comedy there, surely. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for these two interesting questions. So the first one, I think it's an important aspect. I'm really grateful that I can add that. I mean, Kafka was not going to the art shop and buying brushes and color and then going to the studio and so being like an artist in its own right. So he was much more sitting at the same desk when he was writing and drawing. So there was no difference, and he's using the same material. So he's using any kind of paper, and he's using the pens he has for writing, which is the pencil and the ink. So there's no attempt, not the slightest attempt to let's say to expose himself as an artist and using that material and so on. So he was using what he just had, and this is also applying for the paper that he's using. So it's anything that is lying on his desk. It could be catalogs of a publisher that he was using. It could be the margins of his lectures, and I think that's really important to know. So this drawing has also the character of, I have to say that this telephone scribbling. So when you are talking on the phone and on the side you are scribbling. And I think we shouldn't let's say devalue this. This has its own right. This kind of unconscious drawing. You're not really thinking and wanting. You have no plan. You're just scribbling. And some of the drawings they have that. And I think we shouldn't think that because of that they are not interesting. I think this connection of drawing to the unconscious is also made important then, of course, later in his writing, especially in das Urteil, what's the judgment. There it's also totally in the center. So he is writing in the night. It's in one night, and he even says that this is somehow like thinking of Freud, which is meaning writing in a state where you are more or less sleepy or half asleep. And so I think that's also a part of this writing in the margins. It's also writing not under the control of, or drawing in the margins, sorry, not always drawing under the control of the consciousness. And the other questions, what was the other question? Sorry, I forgot. Wasn't it the second question?
Well, it was, do we have any pages of text with the images intact in the margins? And if so, it would seem to me obvious that it's not the literary text that we should be looking, which are on Illustrator. We should be actually looking at the content of those.
Yeah, true. Yeah, there are examples in the book of these drawings on the margins, and these are mostly lectures and course descriptions of his law studies, and yeah, it would be fascinating to see if there is a correlation, but I suppose it's not really the case. So I don't know if you want to add to this. Maybe a quick,
I love the question, and Andreas, I loved your response. I think one thing we can say about the choice of paper, right, which is sort of haphazard and not, it's revealing of a certain kind of intention or a lack of intention, right? He didn't, as you're pointing out, he didn't upgrade and graduate to an artist's sketchbook. He didn't use fine paper. So it says something, I think, about the intentions. Maybe this goes back to this question around danger, right? I mean, the danger of turning these drawings into something they're not. I was never very convinced that there was an aspiration on Kafka's part to become a visual artist in the same mold of his artists' contemporaries, right? He didn't. And through choice of materials, we sort of see that, right? He's writing on scraps of paper. He's not, with the exception of the one-bound drawing book, right? He's not using drawing substrates that other artists of that period would have been using. So it's quite revealing.
I think, sorry, I should probably underline this, the drawing book, because we haven't been talking about that. So indeed, Kafka has drawn in one book from the beginning to the end. This is somehow a book as an experiment in drawing. And this makes it somehow also clear that there was, to a certain extent, the intention of, I'm working now on the material and I really want to experiment in drawing. So there is one drawing book. And we do not know if there have been others that are lost. Actually, of course, it is the case that we don't have all the drawings that Kafka has done, and some are lost. But the drawing book, I think, shows that there was a seriousness after all. And in the letter to Felice that I already mentioned, he says that the letter is from 1913, and he's looking back and saying that these drawings have been the most important thing for quite a time. It was years ago, which refers to his time of his studies, but he says, it was the most important thing for him. So it's not that it was just, he had this intention to become a drawer to a certain extent.
Christina, you had a question, right?
Thank you to both of you for this fascinating introduction to the drawings. I have two questions. The first one is about the early date of the drawings. To what extent can you really know from what period some of the drawings are? Are you just inferring that, or are they dated? And then how do we explain that there are no drawings after that? Is that because Brode didn't have access to them anymore? Is that because he destroyed the drawings that he did afterwards? Or is it that he stopped drawing for some reason? The other question is about sexuality. Is there anything in the drawings about sexuality? Because the body is so important, because the subconscious is so important, and you talk about the importance of limbs. Are there any erotic limbs in the drawings? I mean, you know, I wouldn't expect it necessarily from Kafka, but certainly from other artists of the time.
To begin with the second question, I think you are right. It plays a role, but it's not like immediately visible. So you have to look really close to see traces of somehow also that part of the body, the sexual part of the body. There are a few of them that they give hints to that, but most of them, I would say, they are showing the body in a, let's say, sexual, more neutral way. Some of them are. I mean, it's clear that for Kafka, this was a huge topic in his writings anyhow. And it's not absent in his drawings. But again, I think this would be a question of working with the drawings also in the future in a more, in a deeper way, in a more close-looking way. And the other question, actually Kafka didn't stop drawing. So I didn't have the chance to make that clear. It is true that the large part of the drawings, they are from his time of his studies. He ended his studies in 1906 with a dissertation, but he didn't stop drawing. And an interesting case is to see, let's say, it's not a real transition from drawing to writing, but if you look at the early diary, which starts in 1909, end of 1909 and beginning of 1910, there are still drawings in the diary. So he uses the diary for both writing and drawing. but only the beginning of the diary, and then he moves to a diary which is really writing and also exercises in writing. But he is inserting drawings also in letters and in notebooks until his last year. So he is not stopping to draw. He's just putting it, let's say, in the background more than in the foreground. And it was clear in the foreground in his early years. So I think that that's also important to take into consideration, that the drawing was never stopped. It never really stopped. It was just, let's say, put into another relation of importance. Yeah.
He was first. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. I have not so much a question as an observation that's come to me hearing the questions and the responses, which has to do with this notion of the sketch-like nature of these, or effectively what you were saying, Andreas, there's doodles, some of these. You know, I mean, and that on the one hand is this image of a kind of unconscious that's been released, but you know, it might make us think, well, so how seriously should we take these? Coming back to the first question, you know, or we may be making too big a deal out of them. But it's occurred to me that there's another way to think about that, which is to think, you know, I think that in the last 20 years, 30 years, literary scholars have become ever more aware of the fact that the writings are also effectively doodles. You know, the images that we have of Kafka's stories, and certainly the novels, are projected through the editing work of Max Brod. And one of the most important sort of editing projects of Kafka is, as you know, this, I can't remember what it's called, the critical blah, blah, blah version, which effectively just reproduces the text from Kafka's notebooks and his diaries, whereby a lot of the sort of stories and bits of the novels that we're all familiar with as kind of rounded wholes appear piecemeal. And Kafka would write a couple sentences from the beginning of one of the stories we all know, and then break off and have a diary entry about what he did in the afternoon. And 4 pages later picks up right after that. So there's a degree to which his writing is also doodle-like, or, you know, sketch-like, fragmentary. And, you know, one way then maybe to think about the drawings is as an analogy to that, which is not to say that somehow, you know, those are the finished products, but I think it raises the question of how we're really supposed to think about the relation between, you know, a sort of preliminary text, a doodle, a sketch, and a finished product with Kafka, which he very rarely actually got to that stage of. So I don't know, it just seems to me that that's maybe another way to think about the nature of the drawings in relation to the writings.
Andreas, would you like to answer to that shortly?
I can say you're totally right. So I was writing on this in another occasion, that the fragment is not just something which is by accident important for Kafka because he deliberately chooses it. So the book I showed, The Stoker, has the subtitle Ein Fragment, a fragment, and he was very consciously addressing and searching the fragmentary form. Actually, the Kafka that we know through Brod is actually not the Kafka that's the way he wrote by himself. So Brod tried to make out of Kafka's text something like an entire or an entity, a totality of a piece of art, with bringing the novels to an end and so on, and the stories making the stories a linear tale narration. But if you go to the manuscripts, and then it's absolutely not the case. So I just say you're totally right in that. I would also see it in the same way, that the doodles, the sketches, the way the drawing is also, as we just said it, not only rehabilitated, but promoted as a known way of drawing. You find it in the writing in the same sense. So I just can agree to you. You're totally right. Yeah.
Okay, maybe last question.
Thank you so much for all of this. I would just say on this point, constantly trying to figure out what the relationship is, that for an artist, it's, these are different tools, and it's only for, art historians and literary critics that these things become much more separate. And I'm speaking as an artist. But the thing that I'm much more interested in is this question of ownership. And since this was brought up, how the drawings and his literary output was controlled by other people, I'm just wondering about the publishing process that you've gone through. So what are the, who owns these rights now? What are the, financial consequences of wanting to maybe publish these drawings? So it's essentially, repeating the story that maybe in the past someone, had control over and monetized access, and does monetizing still continues in relation to this output?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because it characterized the history of the transmission of Kafka's manuscripts for decades. So who owns these manuscripts and all that, all these questions? And I told only a small part of that story. The family of Kafka owns also quite a part of the manuscripts, which they are not in Jerusalem, they are in Oxford at the Kafka Research Center, the Bodleian Library, and the large part of the Kafka manuscripts are there. What I just learned is that they only, for 2 parts, belong to the Bodleian Library, and 2/3, and 1/3 they belong to the family, which means every 3rd letter belongs to the family. They told me it's really the case, so that's also a problem. And in the case of the drawings, of which the largest part is in Jerusalem, physically they belong now to the National Library of Israel, and they won the trials. They had the better lawyers. I would call it like that. They had more money to spend for lawyers. It could have been different, because Brod donated this to his secretary, and it could be now the case that it would belong to the family of Hoffe, to their heirs, but it's not the case. The right, actually, that's what I wanted to say. The one thing is the question who owns the drawings, and the other question is are the rights free? And they are free. So Kafka is free since the 90s. So the rights on Kafka, everybody can publish any text on Kafka, and the drawings. You could write tomorrow a book and edit the drawings anew and say this book is worthless. I make a new edition of the drawings. You could do that. Nobody could prevent you. You just have to find another publisher.
Interpretation. And I think it's in that spirit that access works, is because that is when all these multiple responses and voices came from.
True, and one important thing that the National Library in Israel did is they made immediately accessible these drawings. So they didn't hesitate a second, and I'm really grateful that the material came to the library and now is in professional hands, and it's open, accessible to everybody who wants to do research on these drawings. So there's no restriction anymore.
On this quite positive note, I would like to come to a close of this event. And my thanks go out to Nicolas and to Andreas for extremely fascinating panel about writing in the margins, but not being in the margins, as we can see from the noise the book makes, and all these sketching or drawings are making. The question of noise might possibly also blind us. I'm really happy that you are here to open our eyes to see what is really before our eyes. This was very, very nice tonight. And my thanks go also out to my audience for their questions, and Christina and the German Historical Institute is inviting all of us to some drink and nibbles over there, and maybe there we can continue, at least people who are here, unfortunately not you on Zoom, we can continue our discussion. So good night and safe journey back home.